Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the press and those listening on ZJB. Welcome to this last press conference of 2017 by Her Excellency the Governor, and also her last press conference before she departs Montserrat at the beginning of January. The format will be as usual. Her Excellency will make some opening remarks and then we'll open the floor to questions. So, Governor.
Okay. Again, welcome and good afternoon and season's greetings. Members of the press corps, this is a end of many engagements that we've had over the last 2.5 years. I just wanted to be sure that I did meet with you again before departing just at the beginning of next year. And of course, this being the Christmas season, this being the end of my term, this being the end of the year, I've made quite a lot of public comments recently, so you may have heard them. But I wanted to take this opportunity in particular to engage again with the press corps for a final time. I'm going to extend my thanks at the end after we've had questions, so don't think that I'm being rude by not thanking you, which I do sincerely. But I thought it would be useful to begin as a summing up, just to touch on the main areas that I highlighted in my first press conference as governor a year and 2.5 years ago or so. So I'll just raise those three sets of questions. I first looked at what pathways we could take to lead Montserrat to success, how we could tap into the island's potential. Remember, I referenced honoring, our traditions and embracing the future. Secondly, I asked a set of questions around how we can make a positive change in the areas of safety and security, which is a responsibility of the governor. And also in that, how do we best protect children and the vulnerable? And finally, what steps do we need to take to improve Montserrat's public service, which, as you know, the governor is the head of the public service, delegated through the deputy governor. And that's been a very busy and inspiring area for me during my tenure. I'm not suggesting or directing what questions you might ask, but I thought it might be quite useful to discuss perhaps the degree to which I, as governor, have helped Montserrat accomplish progress in these areas. So with that very short introduction, I would like to open it up to questions, and then I will make some closing remarks.
Okay, who would like to go first? Ladies first, Nerissa.
Okay. Thank you, Governor Carriere. Looking back at the highlights that you just gave us, one of the things that we would note is that you actually came in at the same time as the new government. So first of all, talk us through that whole process of working with a fresh team, most of who did not have governmental experience on that level. What was that dynamic like, and how do you think it could be better in the future for transitions like that?
Okay. Thank you. Well, I think the government when was the election in the sitting? September. So it was almost a year, I think, when I came in, but you're right, it's a very fresh time especially for people who haven't been in government before and who haven't been in parliament or may have been in parliament but not in government. I think one of the most critical ways that I engage with the government is through cabinet. And I consider cabinet to be a very important forum because it's where government business basically gets done, and it's where consensus is necessary, but also it's where everything comes together. It's where the analysis that's provided by public servants to ministers on the basis of evidence and so on shines or doesn't shine, and it's where the arguments that ministers make for the submission that they're making, how they make those arguments, and it's about how we work as a group. And I have to say that, and I know this from talking to cabinet ministers, that I've enjoyed very much working with cabinet. I've enjoyed the discourse. I've enjoyed very much how we've learned together to be as a cabinet, because as you know, the Constitution actually refers to the governor as the president of cabinet, so the governor leads cabinet. It is the place where you learn most about the whole scope of the business of government, because it's everything is included there, including the areas of my own responsibility and that of the deputy governor. So I would say that for myself, as well as cabinet, was as well as the cabinet themselves, was the best introduction and the best focus sort of learning experience. I think one of the key things that has been a learning experience and something that is, I think, sometimes difficult, is the relationship between ministers and PSs, and the relationship between the political part of government and the public service. And our Constitution lays out very clearly a division of that, and I think that's very important for a place as small as Montserrat. And I think that is sometimes difficult, but it is something that I think I've strongly advocated, that we keep those two things separate as much as possible. So I think that was another learning experience, is just how that works and what the mechanisms are, and how sacrosanct, in fact, it has to be that the public service is allowed to operate, and particularly when it comes to human resources, without any political interference and in a fair and transparent manner. We have had, I think, some weaknesses in our administration of human resources in the past, and I think that has complicated things, both for the government coming in fresh and for myself as governor. But I think that we're on a good path. We've done a lot of work in that year. So I think I'll stop there, because I could go on for the whole morning. It was a very interesting experience.
All right, let me just follow up on your HR question then. What would be your guidance to the incoming governor about how to continue this pursuit of excellence as it relates to developing a better public service?
Well, I think most people know, I think, that the Empowering Excellence program is now well underway. It's very well embedded with the private sector as well as in the public sector. It's well managed, and it's has senior oversight from a cabinet committee, which I chair along with the deputy premier. So I think that certainly in fact I have advised that this is a very robust mechanism, and it's well established, and as the governor, the incoming governor will have the responsibility of leading this. So I would say lead this. I would also say that human resources is one of the things that has occupied a lot of my attention and a lot of my time. So you have to really understand how it works, and how it works in the Montserrat context, including the presence of the operation of a public service commission, and understanding both the Constitution and general orders and the coming to implementation of the Public Administration Act, and a lot of other acts too that pertain to the operation of the public service.
James?
Yeah. Your Excellency, so you've mentioned one of the pillars, HR, public sector or public service reform, and you spoke of raising the level of key issues which will put Montserrat on a sustainable path going forward. How satisfied are you, apart from the HR public service reform, that we are on that sustainable path, dealing with other issues?
I'm I'm quite satisfied that we have some very good foundations, but I'm not a person who thinks that once you have a few things in your pocket, you can just sort of sit back, because continuous change is a reality, and continuous change is continually resisted in a very natural way. So I think we have to just persevere, and I don't think we should take anything I don't take anything for granted in terms of sustainability. But I think there are some things that obviously are there and very visible and very prominent, where there's no turning back. Areas such as the reform of the prison, which is not complete, but certainly we've done some very significant things there. The increased community orientation of the police and their training in areas such as child safeguarding, which they've focused on a lot, and other areas where recent apprehensions that they've made they've apprehended several situations, criminal situations, where they have proven that they're applying their learning. The really, really happy circumstance of the patrol boat, which will arrive after I leave, sadly for me, but I'm very happy that it will be there. I think that's going to be a real shift and a sea change, if I can use that term, for Montserrat and for the police. I'm very, very pleased about the establishment of the Child Safeguarding Unit and the passing of the legislation, which in its debate in the Legislative Assembly was said that's just the beginning. I think that's very true. But that is established, it's embedded, and it'll go forward. So those are some of the things that I'm quite pleased. I'm not taking full credit for all of them, but those are things that I particularly put my shoulder to the wheel on and really pushed for.
Obviously, there would have been some challenges along the way. Is there anything that you might have thought of that you probably would have approached differently, based on where things are at this moment?
Well, I think every human being would say yes, looking back. There are things that I would have done differently. So yes, there are things where you learn, or things around you change. Could be personnel, it could be policy, and so on. Of course, there are things that I would do differently if I were going to do them again. I think that's a very human thing. But I don't think that I would change my attitude. And I think that's what really has carried me through. And that is an attitude of openness, of optimism, of inclusiveness, and a view that even though opinions might differ, that there is always a way through consensus, through building support, through conversation, of coming to an agreement on things. And I've practiced that very thoroughly, and I will continue to do that.
Yes, please. Your Excellency, I am Gordon Mullings for Montserrat Reporter, and I'd just ask you if you could give us, the Montserrat public, a listing of what you would consider your top 3 specific achievements, and also what you think would be the top 3 issues for Montserrat going forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think, Mr. Mellons, that I've touched on the most, what I think are the most significant. So I've mentioned security, I've mentioned child safeguarding, protecting the vulnerable, and I've mentioned the public service. I think those are my top 3, not necessarily in that order, but they're all right up there.
Those are your top 3?
Yeah,
okay.
I think in terms of accomplishments, yes.
And going forward?
So going forward, I would say those are going to continue to be key issues for Montserrat, for the government, and for the governor. going forward. And we have to bear in mind that the governor's responsibilities are outlined clearly in the Constitution under Section 39. And so the responsibility for security, which includes the airport and the regulation and so on, for the public service. So those are outlined, and those are the things that I've focused on. And those are the areas where I have tried to make a difference, really. So I would say Montserrat, in terms of safety and security, there are two issues there. One is we are a safe place, we are a peaceful place, and we need to do everything we can to keep it that way, because we're not necessarily in that kind of neighborhood. And the vulnerabilities and threats that face us, we have to be prepared for them. And I think, the strengthening of the police service and the patrol boat and so on are going to help that. But we shouldn't forget we have an exclusion zone, which is very porous, and the accessibility is not able. We're not able to patrol that area yet as well as we'd like. So let's keep Montserrat safe and secure and peaceful, because we all depend on it. And we depend on visitors, and visitors come here because it's that kind of place. I think that's very important. I think arising, out of this past hurricane season, this whole issue of resilience has come to the fore, not just for Montserrat, but in the region, and in fact for the UK, recognizing that the degree to which you can, sustain yourselves and recover after a hurricane depends to a certain degree on how resilient you are as a nation or as an island. And that includes the way we administrate ourselves, but also our infrastructure and then our mechanisms and methodologies for preparation and response. So I think that's come to the fore. Our experience this year, thank God, did not involve a major disaster as it did in some other territories and in the sovereign countries in the Caribbean. But we learned a lot of lessons this time. And there's a lot to be tightened up on. And the other thing we learned is that we are very good when it comes to pulling together. I don't think that's a lesson for Montserratians, because I think they know that from the things they've been through. But we haven't had major threat of disaster since, for 5 or 6 years. And I think one of the things that I noted, particularly in the public discourse on the radio and so on, was this continuous reference to the way Montserratians pull together and how they use their experience of those difficulties that they've had in the past with Hugo and the volcano. And I think that spirit was very much rekindled. And I hope that continues. I think that's very important for Montserrat, particularly because the makeup of the population has changed. And that sense of cooperation and resilience needs to include all Montserratians if it's going to be successful. And then I would just say the whole issue of vulnerability of children, child safeguarding, the tightening of our legal structures for dealing with that, the movement away from an attitude that a prison is for incarceration, but it's for rehabilitation and it's part of the community. I think those are important things for Montserrat to embrace. We have a lot of work to do in terms of redrafting legislation and so on and so forth. And I think that's going to occupy us going into the future as well.
Thank you. If I may follow up, I'll observe that in the recent Joint Ministerial Council, the 17th paragraph, the United Kingdom and the overseas territories jointly commit to ensuring social, political, educational, economic progress. This is, of course, directly from the UN Charter Article 73 on overseas territories on that like. I would like to focus a little bit on the issue of economic transformation. Going forward, where do we see the ensuring of economic advancement of Montserrat?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say that that area that you're asking me is not my domain, aside from my responsibilities in good governance. That is the Premier's domain, and I wouldn't speak for him on that. I know he has vision, and I know he's quite capable of articulating it. I would just say that from the observations that I've made and the conversations that I've had in cabinet and so on, is we know that tourism is a mainstay, that developing not just extractive industries but productive industries in Montserrat is something that people are looking at and using our resources and our young people, making sure our young people have an opportunity. So I'm not articulating an economic policy or an economic strategy. I will leave that to the Premier to do.
If I may. I do agree that the actual economic policy for Montserrat comes from the Premier, but we are in a partnership. You are an FCO officer, in fact, the senior FCO officer here.
I'm not an FCO officer, sorry. I'm the representative of the Queen.
Okay.
Yeah, that's quite a different role.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't implement as an FCO officer would. Yeah, it's a different role.
Okay.
Yeah.
The point is that it is a foreign policy commitment of the United Kingdom to ensure economic, among other things, advancement.
Yes.
And that is the context in which I asked the question.
Yeah. So I think it's very important, and you also couched it in terms of Brexit, because that was a major topic of discussion. There was a lot of discussion from the overseas territories about how that might affect them, but particularly demanding a voice in the way the negotiations go and what comes out of that. I think that was a strong theme, and I think those concerns are mostly economic concerns around trade and so on. With regard to how you opened your question about the commitment of the UK government towards the overseas territories, I think it's clear from that communiqué and from other discussions that have been had that the UK government is looking at the way in which it discharges its responsibilities towards the overseas territories. And I think that actually for the last 2 or 3 years, the minister responsible, the FCO minister responsible, has brought in a strong cross-government, cross-UK government contingent of ministers and discussions. And I think that will bode very well for a better understanding across the board in the UK government of the needs and issues in the territories, including their economic needs.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Governor, just to follow up a bit on what you just shared there, I'm thinking of the economic situation for Montserrat in relation to how it actually would affect child safeguarding. Because when parents, adults are under pressure, it's usually the most vulnerable that suddenly need protecting. So how do you see the overlap of the need for us to have a stronger economy so that our adults are under less stress, that our children and or elderly are not being abused because of that dynamic?
That dynamic certainly exists, but there are no statistics in Montserrat that show that there's an overwhelming link between, say, poverty or hardship and child abuse, for example. In fact, there's no evidence really here. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but there is no evidence. But there's no question that families under stress are more vulnerable to domestic violence of various kinds, or living conditions which sometimes mean inappropriate contact between people. The economy or economic well-being is at the center of many issues in Montserrat. I think including, the way the labor market is structured, for example, and the informal and the informal sector, and what kind of wages people get. And I know that's been something that Cabinet and the labor community have certainly been talking about, and it needs to be looked at. Because it can easily happen, as it's happened in other countries, where you get a segregated labor market and then a segregated communities, and people who don't feel integrated in the environment or the community that they're living in will consequently be marginalized and will not be affected by, say, the major movements of change or improvements that take place. So I think these things are all connected, absolutely, and they have to be thought about very carefully. And I do know that in the conversations that I've had with people as the economic strategy was being developed, the growth strategy was being developed, I did emphasize that these kinds of social dimensions should be considered. It's very important, and I'm sure I haven't seen the strategy itself yet, but I think it should be far-reaching in that sense of thinking about the demography of the country as well, because when you mentioned vulnerable, we're also talking about people who are aging, and we have an increasingly aging population, and there is a vulnerability there. They're not wage earners, and some of them are not well off. And in some cases, their families cannot support them. So what are we going to do economically, not just to ensure that we're economically viable and that we can sustain systems that support people, but that people have the means and the understanding to look after people who are vulnerable.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'm glad for your response just now to Nerissa's question, because, and you mentioned the economic growth strategy that is being put together, and the social component of that strategy is highly dependent on the economic platform that is set. So I'm very happy that you answered it the way you did.
Thank you, James.
Yes, you're welcome. Going back to security, and might I say that it's not necessarily a plug for the Royal Montserrat Police Service, but be it as it may, support for the RMPS in executing their duties. In light of what we had this week with this Bulgarian coming ashore, this unmanned aerial vehicle, or drone as we call it, through the Ministry of Communications and Works ICT program, I was earlier at handing over of this key piece of equipment to the RMPS to help them. So I know that they've been clamoring for support like this, and one missing element, I think, is the CCTV cameras. I don't know what's the status with that. So in terms of the support for them going forward, and mind you, I'm looking at total security of Montserrat and our borders, which are very porous.
Yes.
In looking for their support going forward. What are we doing? I know that you're on your way out, but I know that some efforts have been made. So give us an update as to where we are regarding that.
Okay, well, security is now on the government's policy agenda, which we didn't have a policy agenda a few years ago, but it is now there, and I think that's very significant. The other significant thing is that while most things that need to be funded in government have a minister who represents them at the table when the budget is discussed, security does not specifically. So I've taken it upon myself to act as that minister, and I've been a very strong proponent of support for security. I think security is still underfunded, and I think, I work very closely with the commissioner. He reports to me, and I meet with him weekly, and we discuss these things quite often. And there is a degree of frustration with that, but I think there is a degree of relief as well, because we're getting somewhere on that. The vessel is one thing, the drone is another, better training for the police is another. There is still difficulty in getting things in the budget for the police, but of course they compete with a whole lot of other very pressing issues. But they're learning to do that better. And one of the things that I've initiated, I think that's worked very well in the security and justice sector, is that I have brought all of the security and justice people together to make their case, for example, with the funder, DFID, and during the budget discussions. And I think there is a real feeling that as a sector that strengthens them, so that it's not the police over here asking for this, the DPP over here asking for this, the courts asking for that, but it's what do we need in the budget and to support so that our security and justice sector can function. Because as you know, the police can do a very good job, but if we don't have a good court system, or we don't have a well-supported prosecutor's office, and so on, or good laws for that matter, the wheels of justice don't turn as well as they should. So there is a greater interdiscourse between these segments, and also the establishment of the Justice Board, the Criminal Justice Board, with the and the Child Safeguarding Board too, which is an interdisciplinary, multi-agency thing. So I think we're getting there, where these agencies are benefiting from being able to not only handle cases together and handle matters together, but also make their cases for resources. We're not there yet, but I think we're in a much stronger position than we were. Yeah.
While you're on that, something crossed my mind. Where governance is concerned, we have the judiciary, the executive, and legislature. What's your take? Do you think that they are working together as a governance structure?
The three elements
yes.
of government. Well, they have to be careful about how they work together, of course, because the judiciary needs to be separated from the executive, which it is. And I think that I don't see any major problems with that. In terms of the legislature, they are reviewing legislation. They do look very closely at the conduct of the police and the conduct of the security bodies. I think one of the things that will strengthen that, in terms of the legislature itself being more involved in security issues, is the revival that I've recently done of the National Security Council, which is basically cabinet plus the leader of the opposition. But that body is constitutionally mandated to advise on issues of security and also issues around disaster as well. And I think that body, strengthening that body and have that body more operational will be of great advantage to all three of those elements of government, but particularly to the government and the governor, in the exercise of those duties, but also give the opportunity for the member of the opposition through the legislature, so the Legislative Assembly, to be engaged in that. And I think that's very good, and it adds transparency to the whole focus on security as well.
Have general orders been replaced? Have they been updated? This process that's been going on for well over a decade?
Okay.
And if not, why not?
I can tell you exactly why not, and that's something that we've been working very hard on. So, general orders date back from 1986, and they are the orders that govern the terms and conditions, basically, of how the public service works, particularly around human resources. When the new Public Administration Act was drafted and debated and consulted back in sort of 2010, 2011, it was obvious that that's before I came here, that the new Public Administration Act required the replacement of general orders through a negotiated agreement. I think a lot of people, in fact, I did until I was given that history and given that information, thought that what would happen is you'd have the PAA, the Public Administration Act, that has been signed off, and then you would have regulations that would be like general orders and just substitute for general orders. But if you look at the PAA and the intent, that was never the intent. The intent was that general orders would be replaced by the terms and conditions largely negotiated between the unions and government management. So now that that's clear, and I've spoken on this publicly a number of times, now that that's clear, we have proceeded, to initiate discussions with the unions, we being the government, to begin the process of negotiation using the draft. It's been redrafted a bit, the Public Administration Act and the regulations to implement it as a guide, and that's been accepted by both parties. So it's going to happen slower than I would have wished and that anyone would wish, but I think the good thing about that is that it is going to be negotiated. That's very progressive. We haven't had that before because general orders have basically been imposed on public servants.
The majority of public servants are represented by union?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, we have strong unions. We have the general union, and then we have the teachers and the nurses, I think, unions that are involved in that. Yeah.
One other question. Have there been any changes in the work conditions at the prison for the prisoners? And what changes have been made and why?
Okay, well, we've done quite a lot of publicity around this in the past, and yeah, we've published it. I've talked about it in the press, but I'm happy to answer the question.
Specific question.
Yeah.
Have the rate of pay been reduced at the prison recently?
For who?
For people, the prisoners
No.
that work?
No,
Okay.
it's been
Okay,
increased,
thank you.
actually. They didn't actually have any pay before, and now they have it. So it hasn't been reduced, it's been put into place. Yeah.
So I'll just answer that
Yeah,
question in more
please.
detail. There wasn't before, until 2 years ago, what's called an incentives and earned privileges scheme. There is now. What was happening was that families were providing money to prisoners, whether they were convicted or on remand. And now there's a payment scheme for all prisoners who have been convicted, and they earn their money according to the tariff, where they are on the tariff.
I'm sorry. I'm talking about specific work. If I have a skill and I'm in prison and I do things, I make bricks or whatever.
If you're working in prison, then you get paid for it. Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And the percentage that's taken by the prison and what's given to the prisoner hasn't been modified.
As far as I know, no
Okay.
percentage is taken by the prison. Whatever is given to the prisoners, they are free to spend within reasonable means on what they wish to spend on.
Okay. Thanks.
Your Excellency, just going back to the Public Administration Act and the drafting of legislation. And I know that we've spoken about it time and time again, and you were basically clamoring for support at the AG's chambers. Have you gotten that support that you've been looking for?
This is a problem, I think, throughout the region and throughout the overseas territories. It's improving. But I think the problem with drafting is that we, as a small place with a small AG's chambers, have an enormous amount of legislation to draft and redraft, partly because of the Constitution, the recent changes in the Constitution, necessitating a whole raft of changes in laws, some of which have been done, some of which haven't, but also partly because of our international obligations as a small territory to ensure that our legislation is up to international standards. So I would agree with the chambers and discussions that I have with the AG is that we are not adequately resourced. We are getting some help from the UK in terms of external drafting and especially legislation that has a sort of a regional template. But I don't question the quality of what we're getting. We have very good quality drafters, but it is not always easy to retain very good people.
Why so?
Because there's a lot of other attractions for people, bigger jurisdictions, salaries, all kinds of things. And they, a lot of these people are starting their careers and they're interested in working in various jurisdictions. So it is very hard sometimes to retain people, or they want to go for further studies. That also happens, and that's commendable.
I'm also, I took note of the fact that you mentioned earlier that people's earnings are being looked at, and I hope sooner rather than later, because a lot of ills could result from that, and I know that Nerissa would have asked that question earlier, and you would have responded.
Yeah.
So
there is a committee that's looking at minimum wage, which has been publicized.
So can you share a little bit more with us in terms of their mandate?
Oh, I don't have that at my fingertips, but I think that it's been publicized what their mandate is and their tour or whatever. But I can certainly ask to have somebody release that to the press, because they've already been doing public consultations. So they've engaged, I think, quite a lot with businesses and so on. So you didn't know about it? Okay. Yeah, well, so this is giving it some publicity, which is good. And I will link with the chair of that committee and encourage him to do more in engaging with the public on it.
Any other questions? Nerissa, Gordon, Sylvia, James, it's all yours if you want to carry on. We have another 10 minutes or so.
Well, we don't.
Last thoughts on leaving.
Oh,
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
okay.
No, I was going along the line that Nerissa was going. I know you've mentioned some of your achievements, and what are some of the things that you thought that didn't go so well?
Well, things happen slowly here, which is something that everyone says. Isn't our motto, "We have time for you"? There is a certain element in the systems and that's exactly why we're focused on public sector reform, is to liberate, public service and public servants from some of the cumbersome ways that we do things. Probably I was overambitious in thinking that we would actually achieve some of these things faster, but I am now heartened. You have to do things right. You can't just get a consultant to do a report and then say, well, this is what needs to happen. And I think in the case of changing the public service, we are doing it right because we're involving public servants themselves and the private sector in actually implementing and owning all of this. So it's very Montserratian driven and Montserratian made. But it did take me a year, I think, to figure out how we were going to tackle this issue. And I have a feeling that if I'd come with a baked idea, I think it wouldn't have worked. But I wish that I had been able to start that a bit sooner, because I would see now more of the product of that, although it's going along very, very well. Other things that didn't go so well, I think on the funding issues, being able to see the better management of the budget, particularly around execution of the budget and prioritizing. I think I've worked on the sidelines with that and sat in cabinet and discussed with my colleagues that, and that hasn't, I think, quite taken hold as well as it had. I think the relationship with the UK government, I think that's now, I think there are some openings for that, but I think I've observed that has been difficult at times, and that has prevented, I think, the government of Montserrat and the government of the UK, through DFID in particular, from reaching a common understanding of how to move ahead on things, and quite often not having a common understanding on that. So I've done my best to try and mediate some of those things.
So there's you're saying that there's still some work to do, some continuation.
Oh, absolutely.
Along those lines.
Absolutely. But I think that there's, as I mentioned, and Mr. Mullins introduced that idea about, what was happening at the JMC and so on, that there's a wider kind of understanding across government and a better dialogue across government around that, and that there's policy and there's funding, and the two need to come together better. And so we have a more active engagement across government, and I think that's going to be very positive. Mr. Mullins.
Excellency, I noticed that you spoke to the need for especially a better mutual understanding. Now, going back to about 2011-12, thereabouts, there was, in fact, a memorandum of understanding, which was primarily with the FCO.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there is a question that perhaps the way forward could be through some sort of memorandum of understanding towards development partnership or something like that.
Well, from time to time since then, at least since I've come here, there have been various approaches to setting out a memorandum of understanding, and I can't, for many reasons, it has faltered. The interest on either side not being carried through, but I've often thought that the first step to a memorandum of understanding would be an agreed principles of engagement. And we've had some discussions between the government. In other words, here is the way I'm approaching this relationship. Here are the things I will do. Here are the things I expect you to do in terms of the way we relate to each other. And I think those kinds of discussions, they do take place now through a high-level group that meets monthly or so among FCO, DFID, and the government. And those are very fruitful, because what we do discuss is not just, where's the funding coming from or how's this project doing, but we discuss what kind of a relationship we want and what kind of dialogue we should have. And I think that's good progress. But I always think that establishing those kind of principles and agreeing them is a good step.
Thank you.
James again.
Yeah, Your Excellency, I'm just wondering, I know you spoke a little earlier about approaches, and you would have been in certain settings with the ministers. I'm wondering if those approaches, the way they've been presented, makes good for that relationship that you spoke of to really develop, which will be a fruit for Montserrat and Montserrat's development.
Wow, that was very subtle, James. Could you just be a little bit more specific? So the relationship between ministers and myself, or ministers?
No,
and,
no, no.
Yeah.
Not yourself, but
Yeah.
the approaches by the government
Yes.
of Montserrat with the funding agencies differed. That is
yeah.
my specific point that I'm trying to bring forward.
I got it. Sorry. Relationships between funders and governments are always a challenge. You know, whether it's in a setting, in an international setting, or in a setting with the territories. Montserrat and a couple of other territories, Pitcairn and St. Helena, have a different relationship with the UK government in terms of funding than other territories do, because we are ODA eligible, Overseas Development Assistance eligible, which means that we have access to a fund that is allocated by government through law for international development, but we have supposedly first call on that. So argument about what needs are and first call means and all of that are bound to happen, because those things are debatable and contextual. So I think that's where some of this comes up. The other thing is that 60% of Montserrat's budget comes from that particular funder. That's changing, because now we get more money from the CSSF, which is a fund, a tripartite fund. So it's not just DFID. And it's the Ministry of Defense as well as FCO. And I think that the FCO is much more engaged as a funder and a programmer than they have been before that fund. So I think you're beginning to see, not just two sides sort of, having this discussion, but you're beginning to see a wider group of discussants in this debate or in this discourse about, well, what is the basis of funding and what should be funded and so on and so forth. And I think this is going to continue, and I think it's healthy. Yeah.
Might I just add a slight gloss on that? Until the 2012 white paper, UK government departments other than the FCO, DFID and the Ministry of Defence or the Royal Navy had to be dragged kicking and screaming to the table when it came to meeting obligations towards the overseas territories, and the CSSF has actually drawn them in terms of the disbursement of money to those departments so they can do things in the territories. So in the last 3 or 4 months, I could give you 5 or 6 other government departments who've been here in Montserrat delivering things to support the development of Montserrat in key areas, whether it's airport safety and security, whether it's child safeguarding, whether it is hydrographic surveying of the seabed, whether it's the port compliance stuff. So there's a lot more stuff going on. And as the Governor alluded to earlier, sadly, one of the bad things that happened this year was the hurricanes, but coming out of that was, as the Governor said, much more UK engagement and realisation that there are obligations towards the overseas territories.
So I'm picking up both you and Your Excellency on that point. This whole thing about first call and this thing. With the hurricanes, for instance, and you have places like the BVI and these islands getting hit badly. Montserrat situation would be different. How do you apply that first call that is being so highly touted?
Well, and again, that is being discussed, but I think one of the things that has come out of this, and it was said publicly at the JMC at a public gathering by one of the territory's representatives, that while they are buoyed, they're excited and optimistic about the commitment to build back better in the territories that have experienced a lot of devastation, they recognize, and they actually, these are not my words, these are the words that were spoken publicly, is that they don't want to be like Montserrat 20 years later. That there's some lessons to be learned there. And that point, I think, was put forward by our Premier as well during those meetings. And I think that's something that the UK is, government is paying attention to, because, a lot has been done in Montserrat, but, that we're as some people would put it, we're still waiting. So there's lessons to be learned there on both sides about how to make sure that what we're looking at is actually building back better and is establishing a resilient, whether it's infrastructure or relationships or administration or whatever, that all of the territories should have a clearer relationship and a clearer understanding of what can be expected from the UK government with respect to that kind of support.
Okay, Gordon, last question, please.
Yes, please. Just to help us clarify, could you explain a little more on the principle you have alluded to? I know that, for example, the 2012 FCO white paper on overseas territories says that the reasonable assistance needs of the overseas territories have a first call on the UK aid budget. Could you please explain just a little bit what that means?
Well, I can't, quite frankly, because that is a matter of discourse and debate between the government of Montserrat and the funders. And I don't know, I haven't seen where it has been precisely defined.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen of the press, thank you very much. I'll now pass back to Her Excellency the Governor to make her final remarks to the press as Governor.
Well, this has been a really interesting conversation, but most of ours have been, I think, all of ours have been, and that's one of the reasons why I really do enjoy the press conferences, because you're speaking about what's on your minds, but also the public's mind, and that is a really good way for me. Not only to understand those issues, where those issues are coming from, but to have to articulate, where I stand or what my opinion is on them. So you've been wonderful. You've been challenging, which I appreciate. You've been probing, which is what a good press corps should be. But you've also been, I don't know, you've been warm. You've been real, and I've appreciated that very much. I've not only in our press conferences, but the activities of the press in coming to events and recording events and making sure, our issues, all of our collective issues, get out there and that there's a good public debate, in addition to the public debate that takes place on social media. So I think I just think that you're moving in the right direction. I know we've had discussions about how you want to, organize yourself around, what is it? Not regulation, but self-regulation. Self-regulation and professionalism. And I think that's all good. But it's your call and it's your movement. So that's what I wanted to say, just about how much I value these interchanges. And I appreciate that we're all very busy right now, and that you've turned out and you've spent an hour with me. That's great. I really do enjoy these sessions, and I value them highly. So it will be up to my successor to determine how he wants to relate to the press. Certainly my encouragement would be to continue to have regular press conferences. I would like press conferences with DFID there. We'll see how that works with the new configuration of representation here. I think that's very important, so because I cannot be a spokesperson for DFID. That's not my role, and I shouldn't be doing that. And I think that he will find, as I have and my predecessors have,